Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this webinar being organized by the Awarelogue Initiative in collaboration with the Japan Institute of International Affairs and also in partnership with the Embassy of Japan in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much to everyone who's taken time to join us on this webinar when we focus on foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region. We're looking at Japanese and Sri Lankan perspectives and policies coming out of the region and the impact that they are going to have. We must also be able to focus today on different aspects, different areas that we are going to touch on, which is going to talk about the role of the Indo-Pacific region, how the foreign policy is being formulated across our countries, and the impact it is going to have in the years ahead. We are indeed fortunate to have with us a very distinguished panel, and we're very thankful to everyone who's taken time to also join us today. I will introduce the panel in a short while, but first and foremost, for the opening remarks, I take great pleasure in inviting His Excellency Ambassador Mizukoshi Hideyaki, the Ambassador of Japan to Sri Lanka, to us first this morning. Excellency, over to you.
Good morning. Ayubowan. Wanakam. Ohayo gozaimasu. And good evening for Miss Samaranayake participating from the United States. I am delighted to participate in this virtual seminar on foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region, Japanese Sri Lankan perspective and prospects. At the outset, I would like to thank Awarelogue Initiative for organizing this seminar and bringing together excellent experts from around the world. I am also very delighted that the Japan Institute of International Affairs for cooperating with this seminar. Actually, the president of the JIIA, Ambassador Sasai, was my former boss when I worked in the Embassy of Japan in the United States. And when I told the Ambassador Sasai that I'm going to Sri Lanka only about a month ago, he was very interested in coming to Sri Lanka while I'm in tenure. So I'm hoping that there will be more engagement of the Japan Institute of International Affairs to Sri Lankan affairs. As we all are aware, the relationship between Japan and Sri Lanka, based on the common background as island nation with history of democracy, has been always extremely cordial since the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1952. As a new Japanese ambassador to Sri Lanka, it is my great privilege to serve in this beautiful and friendly nation located at the heart of the Indian Ocean. Since my arrival, Sri Lanka continues to amaze me with marvelous discoveries ceaselessly, which reminds me the lemons, pearls, spices, and cinnamon, the fragrance of which blew softly on the isle, and where the genesis of the word serendipity derives from. I arrived in Sri Lanka exactly 1 month ago, 13th of November. Since then, I have had opportunities to attend the major infrastructure opening ceremonies, such as Kandy wastewater management facility and the new Chulanee bridge. Over the past 7 decades, Japan has contributed to the development of social and economic infrastructure and of human resources in Sri Lanka through providing more than 1 trillion yen loan grants and technical cooperation. In recent years, the bilateral cooperation in the various fields, especially maritime cooperation and academic engagement, has been further enhanced under the comprehensive partnership between two countries. Japan has extended assistance to enhance Sri Lankan Coast Guard capabilities and strengthen exchanges between Japanese maritime self-defense forces and the Sri Lankan Navy. Actually, my first trip outside Colombo was to Melissa, and I met the commander of the Coast Guard of the Sri Lanka. And I did a handover ceremony of a Japanese speedboat to Sri Lankan Coast Guard. That was a very good experience for me. Well, against this background, I welcome today's seminar as a timely event towards the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations next year. Today, the Indo-Pacific has become a keyword of the foreign policy, and the free and open Indo-Pacific, in short, FOIP, FOIP, also became well-known diplomatic concepts, which government of Japan has been actively promoting. The Indo-Pacific region is considered to be one of the world's growth centers today, and realizing a peaceful and prosperous region, thus, is one of the highest priorities of Japan's diplomacy. The new Japanese Prime Minister, Kishida Fumio, in his first policy speech at the Diet, has also expressed his determination to vigorously promote free and open Indo-Pacific. Sri Lanka is a very important partner in realized FOIP due to its geographical location as a hub of east-west shipping route in the Indian Ocean. His Excellency, the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, while delivering the inaugural address at the Indian Ocean Conference held in Abu Dhabi recently, proposed the establishment of a regional mechanism to coordinate issues related to sustainability in the Indian Ocean region. Maintaining freedom of navigation and solidifying rule-based order and essential for promoting peace and prosperity of Indo-Pacific regions. And towards this shared goal, Japan will continue to work in solidarity with Sri Lanka. In fact, FOIP is becoming increasingly important in the post-COVID world, and Japan would like to further expand its cooperation with Sri Lanka. I am confident that Sri Lanka can benefit development and prosperity from inclusive and open concept of FOIP, such as enhancing connectivity through quality infrastructure projects and strengthening cooperation for maritime safety. Japan will continue to play its leading role towards a free and open Indo-Pacific, along with partners including Sri Lanka who share the same vision. This seminar is a good platform to bring together experts to deliberate upon ways forward and means for effective cooperation in various challenges in the region. I would like to conclude my remarks by wishing for the success of this seminar and looking forward to hearing insights from all the participants. And as the participants are from around the world, I would like, when they have a chance to visit Sri Lanka, I would like to have an opportunity for a meeting and have discussions. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much for your opening remarks and for sharing those views and setting the tone of the webinar that we are conducting today on Japan, Sri Lanka. We're looking at foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region. I would like to first introduce our first panelist for this session today. Professor Tsutomu Kikuchi is a professor and vice president at the Department of International Politics at the Ayoyama Gakuin University in Tokyo, Japan. He has been an adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs since 1987. He is specializing in international political economy in the Asia Pacific. He was also a visiting fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra and the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, a visiting professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and a consultant of the Asian Development Bank. Professor Kikuchi, we're extremely honored to have you on the panel today for this webinar, and we look forward to hearing from you in terms of Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you, George-san. Can I share my file? Oh, can you see my file? Okay. Anyway, thank you very much, George-san. First of all, I would express my thanks for giving this quite important, opportunity to speak in front of the people of Sri Lanka and Japan, and also people from all over the world. Today, I was assigned to speak about Japan's 4IP vision or strategies. So I tentatively titled my file Japan's Indo-Pacific Visions. I outlined my presentation. First, I would briefly, explain background of Japan's 4IP visions. Then I would talk about 3 pillars to realize the visions. And I move to how Japan sees the future orders. Now is the US-China relations getting tense and tense, but we, Japan, look beyond US-China relations. We're taking a step toward more rule-based multipolar Indo-Pacific, not just defined by only US-China relations. And finally, I would mention the importance of Sri Lanka to Japan Indo-Pacific visions. First, the background of 4IP and rule-based orders. So already Ambassador Mizukoshi mentioned in his opening remarks, Japan has been pursuing to implement free and open Indo-Pacific visions for last several years. The current Kishida administration inherit Japan's 4IP visions. And Japan's 4IP vision strategy flows from Japan's own experience or strategic views based on our own past experience. That is, Japan greatly benefited from the rule-based regional orders. Sovereign equality, transparency, openness, high quality of economic interaction and infrastructure, and so forth. So we, gain a lot from these rule-based order and also rules and principles embedded in that, orders. However, this regional order now in flux. So Japan, we have deep sense of uncertainty about the future regional orders. So today we have both challenges and opportunities for the rule-based orders. Challenges, we have a serious challenges. One is from China's unilateral, assertive, and coercive behavior, especially in the maritime domains. And also, we have some growing concern about US willingness to sustain the rule-based regional orders, as well as regional securities. And we are now witnessing rising tensions between the US and China. And we have growing concern that Indo-Pacific order will be determined only by the US-China relations, whether in confrontation or cooperation. But at the same time, we have new opportunities. We have seen the many new stakeholders who are strongly committed to the rule-based orders. India is emerging leading regional powers, actively engaged with East Asia and Southeast Asia to sustain regional rule-based orders. But also, small and medium-sized countries in the Indo-Pacific are much more embracing and open and rule-based orders. So those countries in the Indo-Pacific are seeking more independence, autonomy. They are not just pawn in the power politics among major powers. They have the agencies to navigate the great competition between big powers. So in my understanding, they could have substantial impact on the future regional order of the Indo-Pacific. And Japan, in my understanding, we have three key pillars to realize FOIP, a free and open Indo-Pacific. First, keep US engaged in the regions through strengthening Japan's alliance with the United States. Second, Japan moving southward to construct a new network of alignment, bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, and also regional alignment with the country and the institution in the Indo-Pacific. Third, engaging with China, expanding area of cooperation and managing tensions. First pillar, keep US engaged in the regions. So stable regional order require some structural powers, that is balance of powers, to support stable regional orders. The United States is indispensable player to maintain the balance of powers in the Indo-Pacific in the foreseeable future. And also US presence gives Indo-Pacific countries, including Japan, Sri Lanka, agencies, because if there is no balance of power, there is no agency for small and medium-sized countries in this turbulent, regions. The US-Japan alliance is a key component of rule-based orders. Actually, Japan has been struggling to keep US engaged in the region through taking a variety of security measures to enhance the alliance for last decades. Second period, Japan moving southward. So Japan has been actively engaged with the Indo-Pacific countries, India, Australia, ASEAN countries, neutral states in South Asia and South Pacific, including Sri Lanka. Our goal is enhancing regional and national resilience of the country concerned and also the regions, especially focusing on maritime security, capacity building in the maritime security, quality infrastructure, supply chain resilience, sustainable development, technology, and so forth. We have been developing new bilateral relations and also unilateral relations. We have developing the bilateral relation with India, Australia, ASEAN countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so forth. Also, for the last several decades, we have been developing the new trilateral relations. Japan with India and Bangladesh, India and the US, Malabar, Naval exercise, and so forth. And recently, we had a 2 summit meeting of quadrilateral security dialogue, Japan, India, US, and Australia. And Quad is Quad is an institution of huge potential. And Quad will contribute to keeping US engaged in the regions. And also Quad will serve a mechanism to put some institutional constraints on against US unilateral and sometimes to aggressive behavior in the regions. So Quad serve as putting some constraints and also keep the US engaged in the regions. So we have been developing a large number of overlapping and mutually connected plurilateral groupings for the last decades. Also, we have been focusing on developing multilateral arrangement, especially focusing on the economic and trade issues. Japan took initiative to conclude the TPP-11 progress and TPP-11 after US withdrew from TPP negotiations. And also Japan actively engaged in negotiation to conclude RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in East Asia and so forth. The third pillar, Indo-Pacific idea is not against China. We need constructive engagement with China. But pressing task today is to create regional architecture under which China respect for international rules and play a constructive role for regional peace and prosperity. So Japan's engagement with China is critically important for regional peace and stability. But Japan's engagement should be pursued in parallel with the strengthening Japan's strategic position in the Indo-Pacific. So, the Japan have been enhancing the alliance with the United States, and also we have been establishing a variety of unilateral relations with the Indo-Pacific countries. That is, to strengthen Japan's strategic positions in the Pacific. Also expanding area of cooperation and managing tension with China. The basic position of Japan to China is stand up to China, but simultaneously get along with China. The third, playing beyond the US-China relations. So Japan, we share most of concern that the United States has of China. But Japan does not want to be fully entangled into US-China relations, either Cold War types of confrontation or rapprochement or G2. Japan looks for more space for maneuvering and more autonomies in this evolving Indo-Pacific regional politics. So Japan needs regional architecture not defined only by US-China relations. So Indo-Pacific is more than US and China. So Indo-Pacific is not a battleground by two superpowers. It's a playground for other countries to play constructive role to strengthen the rules-based regional orders. So they are not found at the mercy of power politics between US and China. But many Indo-Pacific countries are capable to navigate the great game over the future of the Indo-Pacific. So I think now is the moment to step away from long-standing and old-fashioned assumption or preoccupation that the only major powers can define the regional orders. Finally, the importance of Sri Lanka to Japan's Indo-Pacific visions. As I mentioned, international relations in the Indo-Pacific are not determined only by major powers, especially the US and China. Policies of small and medium-sized Indo-Pacific states, especially those located at the strategic Indo-Pacific points, have significant impact the future order of these regions. So in this regard, Sri Lanka has great potential to play a constructive role. So Sri Lanka, which is located on the strategic trade route of the Indo-Pacific, are very important countries for realizing Japan's Indo-Pacific visions. And I am convinced that rule-based order will bring great benefit to both Japan and Sri Lanka. So I hope Japan and Sri Lanka will further strengthen the cooperation to enhance the rule-based orders. So I thank you very much for your attention. I would stop here. Thank you. Thank you, George-san. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that very enlightening outlay. You based it on pillars in terms of how Japan is looking at the Indo-Pacific region, and also you brought in some very crucial points, some very crucial aspects there when you talked about the potential we're going forward as we are moving ahead, where we are going with this relationship and how this relationship can continue to evolve. Thank you once again, Professor Kikuchi. Let us move to our second panelist for the webinar. Dr. Chulanee Attanayake is a visiting research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Prior to joining ISIS, Dr. Attanayake served as Director of Research of the Institute of National Security Studies of Sri Lanka. She has been a visiting lecturer in the areas of politics in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean, and was an international expert on an international study group on the Green Belt and Road, a project by UNEP and the Ministry of Environment Protection in China. To have you with us today, joining us from Singapore. Over to you, Chulanee.
Thank you, George, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this very distinguished panel. So with regard to this discussion, what I thought I would add, I will take on from Professor Kikuchi's some of the points. And basically, I will add some information on how I see the characteristics of the Indo-Pacific has changed. And I will try to sort of like identify some of the challenges small countries like Sri Lanka is facing. I thought I will not specifically focus on Sri Lanka because Nilanthi is here and she will, I think, give a more detailed insight into it. So I will keep it general. I will give a general perspective, and definitely we can have a more in-depth discussion as we go on. So, I mean, I agree to what Professor Kikuchi explained in terms of the characteristics of the Indo-Pacific, and I totally agree with the fact that the geopolitics and the international relations of the Indo-Pacific is not determined only by the great power politics. And we should not allow that to happen as well, because small countries, middle countries also should have a say in what is happening in our own environment. So, and as we know that this ocean space and sea power has always been a major determinant in in the great power politics in the history as well. For instance, the Great Britain came victorious from the 7 years of war because it exploited their naval prowess with amphibious descents. And at the end of the war, the Kingdom of Britain became the British Empire. So we see similar developments now as well, where the strategic competition and power struggle is happening in the Indo-Pacific region, the ocean space, in the Indian Ocean space and the Pacific Ocean space. And I think the America realized the importance of being a major player in the ocean space at a very early stage. That's why Mahan introduced its concept of sea power, Spikeman's rimland theory, all talked about the importance, and America put a foundation for its future by gaining this centrality in the Indian Ocean and also the Pacific Ocean. So now, after the Cold War period, we saw a region in the Indo-Pacific region dominated by United States in its security and other power relationship. And since the beginning of the 21st century, we see a shift from this. So what we see, for instance, Rory Metcalf in his recent book mentions that America's bid to contain China and India's agenda to become great power, Australia's agenda to alliance building, Europe's opportunity to gate crash Asian space in the Asian century. So for all these things to happen, in Indo-Pacific region has become the center stage of the geopolitics. So as a result of this, we see multiple competing strategies proposed by every country, every major player in the region. For instance, India's Sagar or look east policy and think west policy. And then we have China's maritime Silk Road and United States Indo-Pacific strategy, and Japan. Professor Kikuchi gave a very detailed explanation of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific. All these are meant to shift the nature of the power play in the Indo-Pacific region. So for a period of time, I think we saw a system which is part security system which is unipolar, but a developmental system which was multipolar in the Indo-Pacific region. But from that, that was the characteristic during the post-Cold War world. Now this is changing into partly a stronger multipolar system where even the small players have say in what is happening in the region, and also a security system which is characterized by minilateral alliances. So we see that multiple minilateral alliances are forming in the Indo-Pacific region. For instance, the best example is the Quad. But we also have other minilateral alliances like India, Japan, Indonesia, India, Japan, Australia. In the Indian Ocean region, our part of the world, we see India, Maldives, Sri Lanka. So, and the other important factor about these minilateral alliances is that they are not among the major powers or developed countries alone. So they bring the smaller countries also into some of these partnerships. That I think also explain the emerging importance of the small states. The fact that Professor Kikuchi again mentioned, saying that IR is not going to be determined only by the great power politics. Small players are going to have a say, right? The other important characteristic I see in the Indo-Pacific is the centrality of South Asia. For the first time in history, I think, the South Asian region has become a major power center. So India, like we know that South Asia is a very asymmetric region. India is the play a dominant role. And throughout the history, India never got into any alliances. India followed a non-aligned policy. But we see now India is moving away from its policy of non-alignment, and it is making conscious decisions to get into alliance with like-minded countries. And this aspect has changed the nature of South Asian region, and India's rise as a major determinant in the Indo-Pacific region has eventually affecting the centrality of South Asia. So I think the future of a lot of factors that is happening in the Indo-Pacific region, and the future of the Indo-Pacific region will be shaped in the direct neighborhood of South Asia. So Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, we are all going to be impacted. So we have to have a greater consciousness of what is happening. Now, where does the small countries, small states, or the small island states fall within this framework? Because there is a rising tension and competition among the major players in the Indo-Pacific region to exert influence, we see there is a race for connectivity, whether it's through China's infrastructure connectivity programs or India's connectivity programs. All these major players want to connect with the small island states. So because, and especially in the island states like Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Seychelles, and Mauritius, which are strategically placed in the Indian Ocean region, we see greater competition among players, especially among India and China, but also we see a race for connectivity and the role that United States, Japan are increasingly trying to play in these small island states. And also these countries are competing for the commanding heights of technology, artificial intelligence, and 5G technology. I think we hear a lot about underwater cables and cybersecurity threats and the impact that it is going to have on the small island states, smaller because these developments are happening within their immediate neighborhood. So like a competition which was earlier sort of like more in the security realm, or where we saw that armed race, has transformed into an economic competition right now. So economy has become a tool of influence in all these small countries. So how this is impacting these small countries? We see a lot of discussion about great power competition and its impact. And one thing we have to admit is that for the small countries, in most of the cases, this competition has become an opportunity because these competition provide them the much needed funds for their infrastructure development, for their economic development. So they partly get benefit from the power struggle and the great power competition, unilateral alliances among these major players. But so in terms of economy, for instance, they get to play over one country over the other in order to realize their foreign and economic interest. Because Sri Lanka is one of the examples that one of the countries that we are discussing today, I think we see Sri Lanka has been doing this for a longer period of time, maneuvering between, especially between China and India to realize its foreign economic interest. And then we see increasing security partnerships as an engagements. Now, this is apart from the minilateral alliances that I discussed before. India has intensified its security partnership with small neighbors. India have multiple security activities, and then the US also make frequent port calls to countries like Sri Lanka. I think the best example is in 2018, Sri Lanka was invited to be a partner of the RIMPAC exercise. This shows the, so from these activities, what is shown is that the advantage small countries get in order to realize their economic security and developmental interests. For instance, another example is Bangladesh and US launched joint naval exercise called Carrot in 2020. And in 2021, the US Africa Command held the Catlas exercise in Djibouti, Kenya, Madagascar, and Seychelles. So all these are examples of how the small countries and the small island states in particular are becoming strategically involved and important, and how they gain the benefits of the power struggle in this region. And also there are very challenging aspects of this situation as well. The worst case scenario is the fear of having a nuclear war. I think Sri Lanka has raised its concern several times of increased militarization in its maritime neighborhood. And I mean, Sri Lanka has raised this concern even during the Cold War period, where Sri Lanka put the proposal of Indian Ocean Zone of Peace. And so the militarization of the Indian Ocean region is going to be a major concern for the small countries. And then the other aspect is the aspect of polarization. So the polarization will be in terms of the ideologies, in terms of the engagements. So when a country, even though like they have the option to hedge between players to realize their interest, there is also a threat of being pushed to a corner and force them to make a choice between two polar, like different polars. And the other, of course, the influence and intervention. We see that sometimes in order to gain greater influence in these smaller countries, the major players try to intervene in their domestic matters, and so that it sort of affect the political stability and economic stability of these countries. So what should be the, what are the current responses of the small countries? One is like hedging, as I said earlier, like so this strategy of hedging is a form of, like, some explain it as a form of alliance, but it is a form of staying neutral. So you hedge between different players in order to realize your own interest. This is a strategy that small countries in Southeast Asia has used for decades in order to navigate between the United States and China. So they have been very successful in realizing their interest in this regard. We see hedging behavior in the South Asian countries as well, to a certain extent, like Sri Lanka for a period of time in the past, in its foreign policy, have always hedged between India, China, and sometimes between United States also, to realize its interest. Bangladesh is doing it successfully between India and China. And then the alliances with the small countries. So the we always bring a major player. Small countries always tend to bring a major player in order to balance the influence of another major player. But the fact is that they have the option of building alliances among the small countries as well, so that their voice is more stronger than before. So that's from my perspective, and I'm happy to have a discussion after after all the presentations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chulanee, for giving us that overview where you looked at it from a small state perspective. That was very important because you also talked about Sri Lanka, but a general phenomenon that is unfolding across the region and how countries have to tackle it in terms of even using policies like hedging. So thank you very much once again. We will now move to our third panelist, Professor Tetsuo Kotani. Professor Kotani is at the Meikai University and a senior fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. His research focus is Japan's foreign security policy, the US-Japan alliance, and international relations and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. He won the 2003 Japanese Defense Minister Prize. He has published numerous articles, both in English and Japanese, and his recent English publications include Crisis Management in the East China Sea and China's military and paramilitary activities in the East China Sea, implications for the US-Japan alliance. Professor Kotani, we're indeed honored that you're joining us. Over to you, Professor. Thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you very much, George, for the kind introduction and also the invitation. So I'll talk about the maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. Indo-Pacific, the term Indo-Pacific sounds new, but I think it's an old geopolitical term. In the 16th century, the Western powers started to develop the concept of Indo-Pacific, first by Portuguese, followed by Dutch, French, and Britons. And in the in the 17th century, at least, the Great Britain became the queen of the Indo-Pacific by possessing India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And after that, Great Britain maintained the dominance in this region. And after World War II, the United States kind of shared the dominance with the UK in this region. And after the UK's withdrawal from the East of Suez back in the 1960s, the United States became the dominant power in this region. But the Soviet Union tried to challenge the US dominance in this region. And today, China is challenging the US dominance here. And I have to remind you that the Ming Dynasty of China actually tried to dominate this region by sending massive fleets up to the east of Africa. And today, China is expanding its influence and power under the slogan of BRI in this region. And there's ongoing great power competition between US and China. And this history shows how important the Indo-Pacific is for global trade and global economy. And there are lots of challenges in this region in terms of maritime security in particular, starting from piracy and armed robbery and smuggling and human trafficking and massive disasters and territorial and maritime disputes among the states. And these challenges are undermining the freedom of navigation and safety of commerce. And also these challenges are destabilizing the regional order. On the other hand, we have witnessed several developments in this region in terms of maritime cooperation. So on counter piracy, we have the recap the regional cooperation mechanism based in Singapore. And this framework is very important for information sharing and also the capacity building. And there are other regional counter-piracy cooperation, such as Marcindo. And more recently in East Africa, this counter-piracy cooperation in the Southeast Asia has been adopted in East Africa. And we have seen massive reduction of piracy incidents in the East Africa. So I think the counter-piracy is a successful model of regional maritime cooperation. And plus, we are developing a Coast Guard cooperation among the regional countries. We have the heads of Asian Coast Guard agencies meeting in the Pacific. Plus, we have a North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. And the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum is consisted by 6 countries: Japan, China, South Korea, Canada, US, and Russia. And this forum is not only for talks, but also this is for actions. So under this forum, the 6 Coast Guards are actually cooperating on law enforcement. So I think this is another successful model of regional maritime cooperation. And among the navies, there's 2 important frameworks. One is the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, and also the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. And these 2 frameworks are very important forums for the regional navies to discuss their concerns and the common challenges. And this forum is also important for confidence building among the rival navies. And plus, on disaster relief, for example, when the massive tsunami hit the Southeast Asia in 2004, the Japan, US, India, and Australia cooperated together. And this became the basis of the current Quad. And also ARF is doing a lot on the disaster relief cooperation. So I can see a more regional cooperation frameworks on disaster relief in this region. And in terms of the rule of law, so for example, in 2008, Singapore and Malaysia concluded their maritime disputes at Itolos, peace-free. And also, I mean, Singapore and Malaysia dissolved their disputes in ICJ. And the Myanmar and Bangladesh resolved their maritime disputes at Itolos in 2012. And the Philippines brought China to arbitration, and successfully the arbitral court made a decision that the China's claims in the South China Sea are not based on the international law. Although China is ignoring this arbitral award, but I think the Philippines' efforts were a very important one to realize the peaceful dispute resolution. And more broadly, there's a consensus among the regional countries about the importance of free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan introduced this concept in 2016, and this concept was shared by the United States in 2017, and followed by other regional and extra-regional countries, including Sri Lanka. And today we have witnessed the largest engagement by European countries in this region, including the UK carrier strike group. And also we just witnessed the emergence of AUKUS among US, UK, and Australia. So to realize the FOIP, there are new schemes emerging, and Quad is, of course, a very important framework to realize this. But the Quad is becoming is covering more broader issues, including economic security. So we have seen lots of maritime cooperation frameworks, but I think it's time for us to move beyond the existing frameworks. I mean, we have many frameworks for talks, but I think we need more frameworks for actions. So as I said, the recap is a great model. It's not only for talks, but it's also a scheme for joint actions. And we have achieved a lot under this scheme. So I'd like to end my remarks with several recommendations. First of all, as I said, we have a Coast Guard forum among Asian countries, the heads of Asian Coast Guard agencies meeting, but this forum still remains a venue for talks rather than actions, compared to the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, which is actually implementing the joint actions. So I think we have to start the joint actions under the heads of Asian Coast Guard agency meeting. And also in terms of crisis management among the regional navies, the Western Pacific Naval Symposium has adopted a crisis management agreement called CUES, Code for Unplanned Encounter at Sea. And I think Indian Ocean Naval Symposium can adopt the similar framework for the crisis management. And because the member countries and the observer countries of both symposiums overlap, so I think it might be easier for Indian Ocean Naval Symposium to adopt such a crisis management agreement based upon the CUES. And I think the regional countries now need to play a more important role to realize the South China Sea Code of Conduct. ASEAN and China have been discussing this for more than a decade, but we are not sure whether they can reach a code of conduct, legally binding code of conduct in the short term. But the South China Sea is a very important shipping lane for most of the countries in this region. So I think regional countries should encourage China and ASEAN to further accelerate the discussion on CUES. And another issue I'd like to pick up is the regional framework for dealing with the submarine accident. There was an accident in the South China Sea over the summer. The US nuclear submarine collided with an unknown underwater mountain. And this accident didn't produce any damage to the region or ocean environment. But in the future, as regional countries possess more submarines, we might see a submarine accident. So I think we have to start, discuss the framework of dealing with submarine issues. And speaking of submarine, there's another submarine issue, which is the submarine cable. This region is a very important area for digitalized communication. There are lots of submarine cables under the sea, but UNCLOS does not necessarily provide good rules for maintenance and protection of those submarine cables. So I think regional countries need to discuss more about the protection of submarine cables. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kotani, for raising some very vital issues there. When you look at maritime cooperation in the region, you highlighted some very critical concerns, areas that require much deeper analysis. As you very importantly mentioned, we need to now look at ways and means through which we are going to start implementing what we have already put into practice, so what we are trying to achieve amongst our countries. Thank you once again. Let me now move to our fourth panelist, Nilanthi Samaranayake. Ms. Samaranayake directs the Strategy and Policy Analysis Program, a team of analysts who conduct multidisciplinary research analysis for civilian and military leaders on maritime strategy, nuclear policy, alliance management, Arctic strategy and policy, as well as non-traditional security. She's an analyst leading several studies on Indian Ocean strategy, including the US-India naval relationship, and provides analytical support in this particular area. Thank you once again, Nilanthi. I know it is pretty late on Sunday evening for you over there in Washington. Thank you very much for taking time to join us and share your views with us on this particular webinar. Nilanthi, over to you.
Course. My thanks to you, George, for your kind invitation. Also, His Excellency, Ambassador, distinguished speakers and attendees, I'm honored to be part of this panel. I was asked to provide my thoughts on Sri Lanka's foreign policy focus on the Indo-Pacific region, so I'll share some views from my personal research. One methodological point that I think is probably worth noting for listeners is that I'm not a Sri Lankan citizen, so I won't be able to share a Sri Lankan national's perspective as may be suggested in the title of the event. But as an analyst of the region, looking from the outside, I'll be able to share some observations from my research. And I have 3 points. So first, to build off what the previous speakers have discussed about the size of countries in international affairs, Sri Lanka can be considered a small state in international affairs. And as a rule, small states usually don't get as much attention as great powers do. But interestingly, because of its relationship to China, Sri Lanka has received a lot of attention over the past decade, and mostly questions about its foreign policy orientation in the context of a rising China. So questions continue to be raised about where Sri Lanka may fall geopolitically, now in an era of strategic competition, which is now the term of art under the Biden administration. It was formerly great power competition under the Trump administration. So my second point is Sri Lanka consistently discusses its non-aligned posture in international affairs, which seems to be a genuine foreign policy goal. But the reality is, as a small state, it faces pressure from India as the dominant country in South Asia, and it sees limits to its freedom of action. So it continually needs to navigate its national level preferences for foreign policy action and drivers at the domestic level, like public opinion, and mediate these. all the while taking into account India's security prerogatives at the regional level. And this is becoming a stronger factor given India's greater threat perceptions due to Chinese intransigence at the border, to include even the deaths of Indian soldiers. Third, we see evidence of Sri Lanka trying to take a high road in international affairs, especially through raising the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace idea, which Chulanee mentioned. Now, to me, this seems consistent with a small state trying to augment its power through collective action by seeking out partners, like how Sri Lanka tried to do with this idea at the UN and the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in the 1970s. So I was also asked to look ahead and see what Sri Lanka could do in this area. So overall, for better or worse, Sri Lanka is under the microscope internationally. So to opt for the better, Sri Lanka has some choices that it can make. And I see three options in this regard. The first I see is economic management. You can see Sri Lanka is ensnared in aspects of what is often known as the middle income trap. It's a lower middle income economy, according to the World Bank. It moved up briefly to upper middle income status, but went back down just as quickly. It also has a high debt to GDP ratio, and it's continuing to rise. And the COVID era has only exacerbated this situation. It had low foreign exchange reserves even before the COVID era. And there's been a lot of attention to Sri Lanka trying to pay service on its debt. So this is mostly a situation where it's playing catch up rather than being proactive and forward in its approach. And you see evidence of Sri Lanka's economic crisis becoming more concrete in the daily lives of citizens, with food shortages and hundreds of containers being stuck at Colombo port, even a ban on the import of automobiles. So I see the country's highest priority as getting its economy in order, and this national level priority informs its policy options. So I think this link is critical to acknowledge. And so options include working with the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank. You see small states relying on multilateral organizations to enhance their power. Also, the EU and its GSP Plus preferences. This brings into discussion the human rights issue and issues of democratic governance. Those enter into the economic equation. So it's important for Sri Lanka to consider this when determining the country's posture on these issues of governance and the direct link to economic prospects. So these are some ideas to remedy longstanding economic problems, but this is mostly reactive. So for my second point is really thinking proactively. Sri Lanka has often discussed about being a maritime shipping hub and how it aims to be this. And it also helps that it's borne out by ground truth through activity in Colombo port and its top position in South Asia. And also it's important as a hub for the wider Bay of Bengal region, including with benefit to Bangladesh and Sri Lanka's role in regional trading networks. And then third is in the diplomatic sphere. It was interesting to see Sri Lanka's president re-invoke this idea of an Indian Ocean zone of peace. And to me, it suggests the potential for Sri Lanka to serve a role for small states to act as a restraining force on the trend toward great power competition that was announced in the US's national security strategy in 2017 and has since been continued under the Biden administration as strategic competition. I think this avenue can serve a purpose in international affairs. So I'll be curious to see to what extent Sri Lanka continues this messaging and any concrete policy outcomes that flow from that. And I'll pause here for our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nilanthi. Thank you for taking us from that reactive to proactive stance, which is something very vital, very important, which we need to start focusing on as we go forward, as we look to the future. And that's exactly what we identify in terms of foreign policy formulation and where we are taking countries forward. So the floor is open. Please go ahead and send your questions or views to the email. As we begin, Professor Kikuchi, if we may start with you, sir, and just draw your attention to some of the facts that you mentioned there. When you talked about those pillars, when you look at where we are going forward, when you look at Japan's role, how do you see this evolving, especially given, and you touched on the alliance with the United States, you talked about the relationship with China, how it needs to continue, how it needs to be strengthened, how there are very vital components that have to be taken into consideration. But Professor Kikuchi, going forward, how are you seeing the relationship growing in terms of Japan's foreign policy in this part of the world, in terms of formulating foreign policy? How are our countries going to be able to collaborate that much further, sir?
As I mentioned, we don't want the future regional orders only defined by the U.S.-China relations. But, so we have been expanding our new alignment with the country in the Indo-Pacific. If you look back the last several years, Japanese Prime Minister visited the Southeast Asia and South Asia quite frequently. That clearly demonstrate Japan seriously wanted to expand our diplomatic relation with the regions. But at the same time, as I mentioned, stable regional order requires some stable power structures. And now the China's powers are rising, and China getting more assertive and building the neighbors. So we need some powers which are counterbalancing the rising Chinese powers. And of course, Japan, we have been, strengthening our own capabilities to, catch up with the rising Chinese powers. But in foreseeable future, we need U.S. active engagement. But as I mentioned in my presentations, we have certain concerns about U.S. foreign policy directions, given current U.S. domestic politics and dislocation and division in the U.S. society and so forth. So we need some additional instrument to keep U.S. engaged in the regions. And as I mentioned in my presentation, U.S.-Japan alliance is the key component of keeping U.S. engaged in the regions. So I think, in the coming years, that role of Japan to keep U.S. engaged in the region are getting more and more important. So U.S.-Japan alliance now becoming more, so-called public goods, not only just, defense of Japan or, defense of, the surrounding regions, providing a basic, stabilizing, forces to the entire Indo-Pacific. That is basic, the conditions for regional peace and stabilities. But in addition, as I mentioned, we are, we don't want to be fully, embraced or the U.S.-China relation is a confrontational or rapprochement. We need certain space for our own diplomatic maneuvering and also some the autonomies. So I think in that context we share that concern with other Indo-Pacific countries. So we have been developing the bilateral and multilateral relation with the country in the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific countries also now they are looking for new partners. And I think, Japan will be one of the most reliable diplomatic partner for the rest of the Indo-Pacific regions. So that is my answer to the questions. Yeah. So we understand, Japan now keeping quite important, the positions, in the current, international relations of the Indo-Pacific. We are not just, subject
Thank
of
you.
the U.S.-China relations or U.S.-Japan alliance.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for that point. And I just want to turn to Chulanee, coming back from that particular point. Chulanee, you talked about small states. You talked about the role. You talked about the challenges that they're facing and how they're going about formulating policy, Chulanee. Just to touch on, you also mentioned multilateral, minilateralism, how minilateral sessions are taking place, how groupings are coming together, countries are working together. Do you think that small states are being left out? Do you think they feel sidelined at some point? How much more can they do in these groupings? How much more can they collaborate or support these groupings or get involved in these groupings? How do you see that unfolding, Chulanee?
Yeah, I think, this is not, just Japan taking some unilateral approach to the Indo-Pacific, but also other countries in the Indo-Pacific, almost all countries taking such a unilateral, approach. Probably, the Sri Lanka also taking, such an approach. So I think, the most important task for us in the coming decades is how to coordinate, connect, mutually enhancing, establish, to create a mutually enhancing, relation for regional peace and stability. And in my understanding, I think, the Quad, US, Japan, Australia, India, quadrilateral security dialogue, could provide basic overall architectures under which a variety of unilateral approach could be mutually coordinated and contributing to the overall regional peace and stabilities. So I think, future of Quad is critical for the Indo-Pacific. But that does not necessarily mean big powers dominate the Indo-Pacific international relations. We are very conscious of the possible concern on the part of smaller and medium-sized countries about the future relations.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kikuchi.
Yeah. So now, even US and China now paying too much attention to the possible reaction from the small and medium-sized countries. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's not only, the current international politics, not just played by big powers. No, the few weeks ago, China held a summit meeting with the Southeast Asian countries. Now, the US, foreign secretary visiting Southeast Asia. So they are now, competing to obtain the heart and mind of the small and medium-sized countries. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kikuchi. Chulanee, if I could just turn to you with that same question in terms of understanding the role of small states, Chulanee. How do you see this within the context of some of these groupings that are taking place? Is there a role? Is there no role? How can they get more involved?
I think at some point, I think Sri Lanka also raised concern with regard to the same thing you asked, because when you see multiple unilateral alliances happening around you, and then when you are not part of these alliances, when these are going to be directly affected your environment, it is definitely going to be a concern. That's why I said in my discussion also that I think it is partly important for the small countries also to take initiatives and somehow use their collectivism among the countries with the countries of of their interest to sort of voice their concerns and their ideas, what they want to happen for the region. As Nilanthi also mentioned, Sri Lanka has done this quite effectively in the past, especially during the Cold War period when it comes to Indian Ocean Zone of Peace at the United Nations and all. Now also, I think Sri Lanka tried to do some of it to a certain extent, but I think I have to agree with what Nilanthi said in this point, like it has become more reactive to what is the more pressing issues at the moment, rather than setting agendas and being proactive in for these kind of developments in the region. So, but still, I think we can all agree that small states are important, and they should get more attention, greater attention, and we have to find our own platforms to voice our concerns, voice our ideas, and establish our position on this, rather than always being proactive to what is happening around us.
Mhm. Definitely. Professor Kotani, if I can just come in with you, there's this point. In terms of looking at, you talked about moving forward, moving into a new realm, new area of understanding. From maritime cooperation, there are lots of issues that you raise, for example, accidents in the region. This is a huge concern. This has been a huge concern for Sri Lanka for a long time as well. It is certainly a huge concern for Japan as well. How do you see us further collaborating in this area between the two countries in terms of policy formulation? What avenues do you see? What opportunities do you see for Japan and Sri Lanka in particular, given our localities in the ocean, given where we are located, given our neighborhoods? What do you see in terms of collaboration that we can probably explore going forward, Professor?
Well, thanks for the question. I think first of all, we have to discuss based on the agreed international rules, and perhaps on maritime accidents, the IMO can be a good starting point. IMO has been providing lots of rules. So based on that, perhaps Japan and Sri Lanka can think about how the two countries can contribute to the maritime safety in the region. And because of the locations of the two countries, Japan needs to rely on the Indian Ocean powers, including Sri Lanka, for maintaining the maritime traffic, maritime safety in the Indian Ocean. So perhaps Japan can learn more about the Sri Lanka's experience and Sri Lanka's concerns in the Pacific, and then jointly we can discuss this issue based on the IMO or international rules, and then we can expand our bilateral forums into a more broader one, inviting the other countries, perhaps including Southeast Asian countries. And then perhaps one big challenge for Japan and Sri Lanka will be how the two countries can collaborate and cooperate on the issues in the South China Sea. You know, the South China Sea is linking both Japan and Sri Lanka, but there's lots of concerns in terms of not only the maritime safety issues, but also maritime security issues. Although some littoral countries do not like extra-regional countries to join the discussion on the South China Sea issue. The South China Sea is an international waterway. So I think the South China Sea issue could be a very important agenda for Japan and Sri Lanka.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nilanthi, just to continue from that point that Professor Kotani was making in terms of further collaboration amongst our countries, from a foreign policy perspective, Nilanthi, are you seeing countries like Sri Lanka or developing countries in general? We're focusing, you talked about one of the first challenges is getting the economy in order. That's one of the priorities. Do you feel that when we look at the much bigger picture of foreign policy formulation, we're very much caught up in basics, necessities, priorities, rather than exploring potential opportunities where we can go forward? Do you think that there is a lacuna there? Do you think that this is a gap that has to be filled? And if so, isn't it time that we start doing that? Do you feel that this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we are facing in the bigger picture?
Yes, I very much agree with your statement, George. I think it's difficult for the situation that Sri Lanka has been for decades with regard to its debt management. So it's hard to turn the corner overnight. So there's a lot of catch up that Sri Lanka has needed to play, and of course, COVID has only exacerbated the economic situation and the broader situation in the country, just in terms of the pandemic and its effects on society. So Sri Lanka is in a difficult position, clearly, but yes, it is, so far I see it as being more reactive and catching up, and some greater strides toward a more proactive, forward approach in terms of economic development. And I think what the country has identified in terms of becoming a maritime hub, I think that holds a lot of promise. And Professor Kotani just mentioned the IMO. One idea could be Sri Lanka has developed the Hambantota report in the south, and we actually saw that across administrations, even with the governance, the dual leadership of the previous leaders, even they made an effort to try to advance that port development. But now ships are essentially needing to be compliant, have low sulfur fuel, compliant fuel, but for according to an IMF regulation. And so Hambantota Port is really trying to capitalize on that, and the fact that you have ships that are going close to the southern port of the country. So this could be an area potentially of Japanese and Sri Lankan collaboration on trying to meet demand signal that comes from the IMO for ships and the need to attain low sulfur bunkering fuel. So I think there are opportunities in the maritime realm for Sri Lanka and Japan to collaborate, and hopefully will help position Sri Lanka to be more proactive in its approach.
Absolutely. That was really comprehensive there, Nilanthi. When you raised some of those areas there and you talked about that potential, I guess that's what we really need to be starting to focus on now, where we are going forward, how we are going to take this relationship into the 21st century. 2021 has come to an end. We're going deeper into the third decade of this century. It is high time that we start claiming the century, start working towards it. And this is where, given the constraints of time, we're moving into the final round now. Professor Kikuchi, if we could come to you, sir, just in terms of your observation, your feeling, when we look at the decade ahead of us, where do you see Japan-Sri Lanka's relationship progressing, especially considering everything that is happening in our environment, in our neighborhoods, in our respective neighborhoods? Where do you see the relationship going, Professor? And what is one of the most important things you feel we should do to enhance the Japan-Sri Lanka relationship?
Thank you. Of course, the first one is in the area of the maritime security, or including shipping. Also, I think I'm interested in how Bay of Bengal ideas are developing in the coming decades. I myself, deeply engaged in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation project since mid-1980s. How to promote trade and investment among Asia-Pacific countries. But at that time, almost none who believe Asia-Pacific countries could develop interdependent economic relations. But what happened after 30 years later? Now, Asia-Pacific economies, we have been developing very close trade and investment relations. But 30 years ago, almost none who believe we could succeed in developing such. So given that, experience, we can, we should start now how to develop the Bay of Bengal economic areas. That is quite, promising areas. And Sri Lanka are located in quite a strategic, the point of, Bay of Bengal areas. And Japan also, we have been developing quite a wide range of economic relation with Southeast Asian countries. But this interdependent economic network have been expanding to include western part of Southeast Asia, including Myanmar, Bangladesh, and also India. So I think Bay of Bengal is not just the developing Bay of Bengal is not just a dream that could be realized within a decade if we get involved in that project seriously. So I think we have much interest in cooperate with Sri Lanka to develop the idea of the Bay of Bengal. Yeah, that is my own. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kikuchi.
Yeah.
Chulanee, if I were to pose the same thing to you, Chulanee, going forward in the next decade, from a small state perspective, Sri Lankan perspective, where do you see this relationship going? And what do you think we should be doing to enhance it that much further?
Well, I agree with what Professor Kikuchi also said, that I think Japan partnering with Sri Lanka will definitely help in terms of Bay of Bengal economic development for sure. On the other hand, bilaterally, I also see that there is a lot of potential for skill transfer and technology transfer between the two countries, especially in terms of skills. George, I think we know that Sri Lanka has one of the best skill sets in the labor market in the world. We see Sri Lankans as achieving leaps and bounds in the world market. And Japan is a developed, highly developed country which spent a lot of effort and investment in modern science and technology. So I think there is a lot of potential for Sri Lanka and Japan to collaborate in terms of this area. That will definitely be beneficial for Sri Lanka's future development as well. And then also, I think another aspect that we can focus on is the sustainable environment protection, sustainable ecology, environmental ecology in the maritime sphere. Japan is greatly affected by the climate change. So is Sri Lanka. I think there is a lot of opportunities for us to collaborate, not just in protecting our respective environment, but also making awareness in the world to explain like why this is so important. And also, I think in the previous presentation, it was also mentioned about the like importance of underwater protection, and like the example about underwater submarine accident. I think in the years to come, this is going to be one of the biggest challenges for Sri Lanka because our geographical positioning. So I think this is another area where we can collaborate on protecting underwater environment as well as underwater sovereignty.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chulanee. Very vital areas that you touched on there. Professor Kotani, going into the next decades, where do you see the relationship going? What do you think should be the main focus of our foreign policy formulation?
Well, thank you. So first of all, now that both Japan and Sri Lanka share the same vision of FOIP, I think I just see a further development of the bilateral relationship over the next decade. And I think to promote our bilateral relationship, first of all, I think we have to further accelerate our trade relationships. Because trade relationships is the basis of the strategic partnership. So I think that's number one area to pursue. And then on security issues as well. as Japan promotes the FOIP, we see the maritime security is a critical pillar of that vision. And we are now promoting the Quad cooperation, including India. But because of the relationship between India and Sri Lanka, I think Sri Lanka can become the Quad Plus member. And I think Japan is open to such a opportunity. So under the Quad Plus formula, I think Japan-Sri Lanka bilateral relationship could be further enhanced in terms of security, not only the military security, but also economic security.
That's a massive, massive opportunity that you just identified there, Professor Kotani. Thank you for that. Nilanthi, in closing, Nilanthi, how do you see the next decade, looking at it from Washington's perspective, and also understanding it from the much bigger geopolitics of what is happening in the region and how Asia is continuing to rise and the key players in the region? How do you see the Japan-Sri Lanka relationship in particular, and how this would impact Sri Lanka and of course Japan, our foreign policies as well?
Sure. Thank you, George. I think the Japan-Sri Lanka relationship is very important. Japan has just been critical to Sri Lanka, particularly in the development of Sri Lanka's ports. When we're talking about Colombo Port, for example, and everything Colombo Port has become in terms of being the busiest port in South Asia. So I think the two countries already have a very strong foundation that they can continue to build on. So thinking about the next decade, any activities that can help enhance Sri Lanka's maritime infrastructure. So I mentioned in Hambantota Port, clearly Japan has a strong track record of enhancing Sri Lanka's port development in Colombo. So what about in Hambantota in the south? And in light of the IMO's regulation on low sulfur fuel, can Sri Lanka and Japan work together in the coming decade to build this fuel capability for ships that are in pursuit of bunkering fuel? Another idea is we've heard discussion about the Bay of Bengal region. Japan, I remember often spoke about the Bay of Bengal industrial growth belt. So really thinking about a specific set of projects that could fall under that branding, if it is still indeed relevant from Tokyo's perspective. I think that could be very fruitful for Sri Lanka, because Japan has really been a key enabler of Sri Lanka's maritime vision and maritime activities. So going into the next decade, I think thinking about that framing could be useful. And then finally, the Sri Lanka Coast Guard, I believe the ambassador mentioned at the beginning, being present for the transfer. That's really critical. The Sri Lanka's Coast Guard is a relatively young service, and it really needs as much capacity as possible. And Japan has been critical in helping to build that capacity for the Coast Guard. I know the United States has transferred retired Coast Guard cutters to the Sri Lanka Navy, but the Coast Guard, on its own terms and as its own discrete individual service, also needs assistance in terms of building its own capacity. So I think Japan also plays an important role in advancing Sri Lanka's maritime security through its activities supporting the Coast Guard. So I think those are a few ideas, but I think there's really, it's limitless in terms of what could be done between the two countries in the coming decade.
Absolutely. And this is where we are at the moment on the eve of the 70th anniversary of relations between Japan and Sri Lanka. But of course, we can trace history where we've had so much of connectivity between our two countries. Opportunities remain galore. Nilanthi, you had a very positive point there, Nilanthi, where you said it is limitless in terms of what we can try to explore. The areas, Professor Kotani, you brought up a very important issue there about the commercial aspect of it. This is where economics is playing such a big role today in the world in bringing countries together. The ocean, the Indian Ocean region, when we look at the Indo-Pacific and we look at the much bigger picture, oceans may be dividers, but oceans are also connectors. And this is where our countries remain connected, not only based on history, but so many other aspects, so many other features that we need to focus on as we go forward. And that was the main objective of this particular focused academic engagement session that we organized through the Awarelogue Initiative in partnership with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. So finally, before we come to an end, thank you once again. Our sincere appreciation to our 4 panelists. Thank you very much, Professor Kikuchi, for your time. Thank you so much, Chulanee. Thank you very much, Professor Kotani. And thank you, Nilanthi. It's very late for you over there in Washington. Thank you so much for continuing to remain with us and sharing, to all 4 of you, for sharing your views, giving us a perspective from an analytical point of view, what we should be focusing on, what we should be looking at, and where we are going to take this relationship in the years ahead. The important thing is looking to the future, strategizing for the future, planning, taking this to another level. This enhancement certainly is absolutely vital in the formulation of foreign policy. Finally, a huge word of thank you to Ambassador Mizukoshi Hideyaki. Thank you very much, Excellency, for the support that you have rendered towards this particular session, for bringing us all together, giving us a platform on which we can focus on taking the relationship forward on the eve of the 70th anniversary. And thank you to everyone who has joined us from Tokyo, from Colombo, from different parts of Sri Lanka, and from different parts of the world, actually. We have participants joining us from several countries, including New Zealand and Australia as well. So thank you very much for taking time to be a part of this particular webinar that we organized by the Awarelogue Initiative in collaboration with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. And so finally, thank you to all of you once again, and we look forward to seeing you at a future focused academic engagement session as we continue focusing on international relations and its affiliated fields and building awareness and taking the level of dialogue to a much higher level. Thank you once again, and a very good day to all of you. Thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you.